Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the global race for critical minerals is heating up. President Donald Trump has invoked wartime powers to boost production. But China dominates the market, so can the US and the EU catch up? Massive social spending, big budget cuts, and setting up a sovereign wealth fund. Plans by Indonesia's president to grow the economy are spooking investors. But could his economic reforms actually work? And lured by lucrative job offers, up to 100,000 people still work in Myanmar's so-called scam hubs, despite a multinational crackdown. So can the multi-billion-dollar illegal industry be dismantled? They're seen as the new oil of the global economy. Critical minerals are crucial to clean energy technologies and defense manufacturing. Demand for them is growing fast, and so is competition among the major economies for rare earths. But it's China which dominates supply chains right now. Washington is scrambling to reduce its reliance on Beijing for critical minerals. The US is accused of using economic coercion to get its hands on the elements and is aiming to ramp up production at home, with Donald Trump invoking wartime powers to increase the supply of critical minerals. But will that help the US break China's grip on the market? Victoria Gatenby reports.
If the last century was about the scramble for oil, this one is increasingly about the control of critical minerals.
Moments ago, I also signed an executive order to dramatically increase production of critical minerals and rare earths. We're also signing agreements in various locations, in particular Ukraine.
The stakes are high for the United States and the rest of the world. China is the #1 supplier of minerals that power global technology. Anything with a microchip needs a rare earth mineral element.
They're often described as the vitamins or the spice of industry because they have, over the past several decades, they've enabled, through advances in material science, our technologies to get smaller and faster and stronger and more resilient.
Beijing tightened export controls on 25 rare earth minerals for shipments to the US in February. That was after President Donald Trump imposed additional tariffs on Chinese products. It's a blow to the US military-industrial complex, which is one of the biggest buyers of such minerals.
Trump wants rare earths because the American economy is highly dependent on Chinese sources, and it's an economic and national security risk. Reason number two is that there are not so many American companies who are able to mine and produce rare earths within the US.
As the race to secure critical minerals heats up, so too do geopolitical tensions. US President Donald Trump says he's interested in the rare earth minerals in Greenland. He's repeatedly threatened to annex the island. And competition for minerals is one of the main drivers of conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Analysts say fighting there is likely to continue as long as there is demand. The scramble for minerals, particularly copper, cobalt and lithium, is expected to soar in the coming years and may further fuel a growing wave of protectionism and resource nationalism that's sweeping across the world. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Well, the US and the EU categorise around 50 minerals as economically indispensable. They're used in consumer products ranging from smartphones to cars, as well as in the production of clean technologies such as electric vehicle batteries, solar panels and wind turbine magnets. It's not just the US that's dependent on China for critical minerals. The EU sources all of its supplies of heavy rare earths from China and 97% of its supplies of magnesium. That high market share has provided Beijing with diplomatic leverage. As geopolitical tensions rise, such minerals are becoming harder to export. Data shows a nearly 5-fold increase in export restrictions on critical raw materials since the OECD began collecting data in 2009. Now, if the world is to decarbonise, it'll need 6.5 billion tonnes of the metals between now and 2050. That's several times greater than current capacity. Emily Iona-Stewart is the head of policy and EU relations, Transition Minerals. She joins us now from Brussels. Good to have you with us. So why is the race for critical minerals heating up right now?
Well, Adrian, as we've already pointed out, there's a number of push factors coming from the industries where there's a huge amount of rising demand for them, particularly renewable tech, digital, but also the defence industries. But why now is a particularly interesting question because, of course, when we look back in time in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed, we already knew that there was going to be a huge rise in demand for these minerals globally. However, it seems that Chinese industrial strategy was already on the track to becoming one of the big players in all of these supply chains. And they took the Paris Agreement very seriously. They saw that there was going to be ramping up of demand for these. And so they were able to put themselves vertically across all of the supply chains for these really key minerals for these industries. Whereas Western nations kind of relied on market forces and they didn't invest in quite the same way. So they were falling behind in that race. And that's something that's really become acutely obvious in the last few years.
What do you make of President Trump's decision then to ramp up domestic production of these rare earth minerals? Does the US have enough of them in the ground? And is that going to help the US stop its over-reliance on China?
I mean, let's be clear, America is a very resource-rich country. There are a lot of minerals there. But first of all, many of those minerals are located in areas which are of huge, significant importance for America, either biologically or culturally. And so it may be that it's not in their interest to dig some of those up. But nonetheless, they don't have all of the minerals that they need for their own economies and technologies. And so at the moment, it's really imperative on America to be going out and doing what we term friendshoring, which is essentially talking to other countries which are rich in the minerals that they need and establishing relationships which will allow them to be part of that supply chain. It's a little bit converse to what we're seeing with the discussion in America and other countries at the moment, which is slightly more aggressive than we might think of when you need to be friends with countries which are rich in these minerals.
Is that exploitation, though? I mean, particularly when it comes to nations like the DRC in Africa?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an exploitative element to this. And it's not just DRC. We've seen that DRC have been approaching America potentially for a minerals deal in order to help them with their own military situation in the east of the country. But Ukraine is a very prime example of this as well. The US seems to be capitalizing on the situation there, offering essentially aid for trade. But it's part of a broader model. These aren't the only countries which are in the US's sights. Obviously, we have Greenland, which, in fact, there is no military reason there for them to be engaging, but the proximity is potentially a threat if they were to annex that, and Canada too.
China also has its eyes on, did you call it friendshoring there with nations in Africa? So you've got potentially these two superpowers competing for the same rare earth minerals on particularly the African continent. Is that going to spell trouble in the future?
Yeah, I mean, the friend part of friendshoring is really important here because actually when it comes to these resource-rich nations, countries, particularly in the continent of Africa, are kingmakers when it comes to these minerals. And so ultimately there will come a time when they're going to be able to pick and choose from the best of what's on offer. And that's why a friendly approach is really important. And what does a friendly approach ultimately constitute? Well, probably high ESG standards, higher than potentially the Chinese companies are offering, because it's really going to be up to these countries to decide ultimately who is going to be there to exploit those resources, how they work together. But also the value addition piece is really important. The Chinese model up until now has been very much based on extracting the minerals and taking them back to China where the value is added through production and then eventually manufacturing quite often. And in the future, I think it would be quite important to resource-rich countries that they see some of that value staying in the country and that some of the production, potentially the manufacturing, takes place there too.
OK, you've got the US and China then racing to secure as many of these rare earth minerals as they can. China in the lead at the moment. Where's the EU in this race? Is it still on the starting line?
It's a good question. I mean, obviously, the EU just over a year ago passed its Critical Raw Materials Act, which was its own answer to, I suppose, the US's IRA and the China's Belt and Road Initiative, with the idea that it would help ramp up domestic production, but also diversify supply chains. Is it on the starting line? To a certain extent, yes, it is. Only this week we've seen the European Commission release a list of what it calls strategic projects, which are projects within the EU which are going to receive backing from the Commission in one way or another to fast track. And we haven't seen the list of strategic projects which are outside of the EU yet. I suspect that that's partly because, of course, it's a much tougher conversation with countries which are outside of the European Union to decide how it is that you'll take projects forward. But in terms of being on the starting blocks, I think what's really important in the EU context is that the European Union's ESP has always been our high climate commitments, our high environmental commitments. And until the EU really starts to capitalise on those, I think it will remain on the starting blocks because it simply doesn't have the same financial heft as the US and China. And what concerns me at the moment is that it's not really walking the walk in countries such as with the DRC, where it has the memorandum of understanding with Rwanda, which kind of demonstrates that those ESG standards aren't really high on the list of ambitions, and also in Serbia, where there's currently protests against lithium mining, but the EU is still going ahead with its agreement there.
It's been really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us. Emily Iona Stewart there in Brussels.
Thank you.
UK Finance Minister Rachel Reeves blamed increased global uncertainty after the country's budget watchdog slashed its forecast for economic growth. The Office for Budget Responsibility halved its growth forecast this year from 2% to 1%. It said that lower than expected GDP numbers plus higher borrowing costs meant that Reeves would have missed her goal of balancing day-to-day spending against tax receipts rather than borrowing. In order to avoid that outcome, Reeves announced measures of around $18 billion, including a series of cuts to public spending to plug a fiscal hole. Well, it comes as the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, warned that the UK government faced strong headwinds as it battles to grow the economy. Speaking in Parliament on Wednesday, Reeves blamed the OBR's downgrade on what she called a changing world, pointing to the war in Ukraine and US President Donald Trump's plans for import tariffs. The finance minister told MPs that she'd rebuilt the $13 billion fiscal buffer and pledged to stick to her borrowing rules. The OBR upgraded its UK economy growth forecast for subsequent years. It expects GDP to increase each year between 2026 to 2029. Joining us now from London is Al Jazeera's Jonah Hull. Jonah, how damaging is this image of a Labour Chancellor making these spending cuts, especially to welfare?
Potentially, I think, very damaging indeed, both among MPs within the party itself and among Labour Party voters, many of whom may agree in the need, in theory, for welfare reform, but who seem now to be seeing this instead as an attempt by the Labour Party simply to balance the books off the backs of the poorest. One MP I spoke to earlier this week said, look, Labour created the welfare state. MPs didn't come into government to watch it being torn down for cash. And one benefits recipient I spoke to earlier this week said, look, where are the measures targeting the interests of the rich? He believes Labour is targeting people like him because they are the people least likely to fight back. So it is a very bad look for Labour. It's only going to get worse if there are more of these measures, which indeed there may well need to be in the full budget to come later in the year.
Which begs the question, if it's so damaging, why is she doing it? Is there no other way?
Well, people say she's boxed herself in. Look, essentially, the Labour Party says repeatedly that it inherited an enormous budget deficit from the previous governing Conservatives, also years of slow or stagnant growth. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, came into office saying she wanted to restore stability and growth, but to do so without raising taxes and without any new borrowing. And then there is the line that the government is using now to justify what's going on, the line that the world, it says, has changed. Donald Trump's arrival has sent the cost of servicing existing debt spiralling. There's much more money that has to be found for defence. There are the threat of US trade tariffs looming and so on. That has led her in search of brand new savings within her limits, and that has her rules, and that has led her here to welfare. It's a move that many see looking on as a sort of extension of the Conservative era austerity-led policies. As I say, an extremely bad look for Labour, politically dangerous, because it is neither the change that Labour promised nor the change that voters voted for.
Al Jazeera's Jonah Hull reporting from London. Jonah, many thanks. Also in the news this week, President Donald Trump says that he'll impose a 25% tariff on all imported cars and car parts beginning April 2nd. Trump says that the measure will lead to, quote, tremendous growth for the car industry and will spur jobs and investment in the US. Mexico is the top foreign supplier of cars to the US, followed by South Korea, Japan, Canada and Germany. Trump's latest move could upend global car manufacturing and supply chains. Auto stocks plunged last week as the industry braced for the measures. On the campaign trail last year, Indonesia's president pledged to give every child a free lunch. That would cost around $28 billion a year. Prabowo Subianto also wants to set up a multi-billion-dollar sovereign wealth fund, which will mainly invest in the minerals sector. Many Indonesians are wondering how the plans will be paid for. Revenues are falling, consumer purchasing power is weakening, and the middle class is dwindling. The president is taking a chainsaw to Indonesia's national budget to fund his programs, but his populist agenda and firm grip on power are spooking investors. They are dumping Indonesian stocks and pulling their money out of the nation. Indonesia's central bank has intervened to shore up the currency, which touched its lowest level in 27 years last week. It's also maintained interest rates at 5.75% in a further effort to support the rupiah. Meanwhile, global investors have soured on Southeast Asian markets due to concern over US tariff threats and sluggish domestic growth, with a shift of capital towards China. James Villaferte is a senior economist at the Asian Development Bank. He joins us now from Manila. Good to have you with us, James. So what was the reason behind this stock market sell-off? Are there real underlying problems with the economy that are behind the rout, or is it just that investors were spooked about the president's decision and don't really know how he's going to pay for it?
In our view, it's still the global uncertainty that has caused the decline in the stock market. As you know, foreign players in the Indonesia stock market comprise around 70%, and 30% are actually retail players. So we feel that much of the decline in the equity flows is really due to external volatility. Although we know that there's some concern about the recent rechanneling of expenditures from investment to the feeding program, and also some decline in revenue in the first 2 months of the year.
The president, James, wants to increase growth to what, 8%? Is that blue sky thinking on behalf of the president, or is that figure actually realistic?
A lot of the countries in Southeast Asia are trying to really step up in the income ladder. This 8% growth is actually an aspirational growth target. This is a target in the medium term to allow Indonesia to become high income in 2045. But I think this is not unrealistic. I think the main question is, how can Indonesia actually deliver a growth in the next 25 years along the line of 8%? And I think there are three main factors that are quite important. The first one really is identifying new growth drivers, particularly investment in green, for example, green economy and blue economy, marine resources. The other one is it has to also create a lot of labor-intensive jobs in some of manufacturing and industry. And the other question is actually the size of investment that will be required. The third aspect, I think, is really the global trend is that technology, innovation, AI, and big data are the ones that are driving growth, particularly in the modern services. And this has to happen. I think in Indonesia, there's a focus on the modern services, which will have productivity spillover effect on both agriculture and manufacturing. So if they're able to create this job, I think they can actually deliver this higher percent growth in the next 20 years up to 2040.
James, will the president's spending cuts help or hinder the economy? And what do you make of his plans to establish a sovereign wealth fund?
First, on the rechanneling to the spending program, this is really a very ambitious program. I think coming from COVID, I think their heart is in the right place. We know the COVID scarring has actually affected a lot of both in terms of education losses and nutrition for young children in the elementary school, in high school, mothers as well as children, and this will actually repair the human capital that was damaged by COVID. This feeding program, which aims to feed around 82 million people, can also be a booster for jobs, no? Because you will need to prepare the food, you will need to have the agricultural output to support this food distribution over 80 million years. This is a very ambitious plan, and the main risk and the big concern is really how they will implement this massive program. But we know that this is a medium-term program. They will not just do feeding 82 million in just 1 year, but staggered over a million years. But I think this actually can create new growth drivers, particularly in the green economy and the blue economy. On the sovereign wealth fund, Indonesia has a lot of wealth, and it's coming from their endowment in natural resources, and it's actually in under holdings by state-owned enterprises. So I think this creation of wealth fund is actually trying to create a leverage so that they attract more capital for every dollar that they have in these massive state-owned enterprises, right? I think it's really coming up with a very clear and transparent guidelines, investment guidelines, and making sure that the advisory of this sovereign wealth fund are really high caliber and global quality. I've heard that some of the appointments actually even include names like Jeffrey Sachs. So this is a good thing for the sovereign wealth fund.
Really good to talk to you, James. Many thanks indeed for being with us, James Villafuerte, there in Manila.
Thank you.
It is a lucrative but illicit business. Online scams generate almost $64 billion a year in global revenue, according to research by the US Institute of Peace. Much of the operations happen in illegal compounds along the Thai-Myanmar border. Thousands of people have been trafficked into the region from across the world, often lured by the promise of work. Many of them are held against their will and forced to make income by tricking strangers into transferring large amounts of money online. China, where many of the scam victims come from, Thailand and Myanmar are now leading efforts to dismantle the centres. Despite the crackdown, so-called scam compounds are still operating, with up to 100,000 people working in them. Al Jazeera's Lena Abu Akleh reports.
A journey home, one that some feared they would never make. 400 Indonesians, mostly men, arrive in the city of Tangerang after being rescued from online scam centers in Myanmar. One victim had this warning to others looking for lucrative work overseas.
Don't be easily persuaded when making friends on social media, because we are the bad examples. We are victims of social media used for dubious job recruitment.
Criminal gangs who run online scam centers lured these workers to Myanmar with the promise of highly paid jobs. Once there, they held them hostage and forced them to commit online fraud.
They experienced physical violence such as beatings and electrocution. Cartel members threatened to remove their organs if targets for online scams were not met.
Such illegal facilities generate more than $60 billion globally every year. Many are based in Myanmar, near the border with Thailand. Thai police are spearheading a regional effort to dismantle the online scam centers, which they estimate employ up to 100,000 people in the town of Myawaddy. Officers have cut electricity, internet, and fuel supplies to the area as part of their crackdown.
The key to the operation in Myawaddy is we have to discharge people as quickly as possible. Various embassies are helping to identify their people and speed up the process. That way the authorities in Myanmar and ethnic armed groups can conduct more crackdowns.
More than 7,000 workers from 19 countries have been rescued from Myawaddy since February. Thai authorities say a multinational coordination center is needed to ensure those responsible for running the scam centers face justice. Lena Abu Akleh, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Judah Tanner is the International Director and founder of Global Advance Projects. He joins us now from Bangkok. Good to have you with us, Judah. How big of a problem are these scam centers on the Thai-Myanmar border, and how on earth have they managed to lure so many people in to work for them?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I mean, the first question, how big is this? This is a global issue now. This is a global crisis. You've got these scam centers where if we say center, we might think of something small. But in terms of the way these operate, we're talking about cities. We're talking about, like you said in the opening, 100,000 people brought into one region. That specific nature of the scam compounds is to effectively scam people in foreign nations. Anywhere that has an internet connection is in fear of being focused on and exploited for within these scam centers, within these scam regions.
It's obviously very lucrative, otherwise they wouldn't do it, but do we know who's behind it?
Yeah, the transnational organised crime syndicate is where it all really began. I mean, a lot of focus is on China because the organised crime syndicate really is traced back to the Chinese criminals that began these scam centres, these scam compounds. It's incredible because I've lived in the region for over 20 years and we watched from these rice fields turn into absolute cities within a very, very short amount of time. And then from the development, we've seen that in a very short amount of years, just 3 years, this industry has built, like you've said, a multi-billion-dollar industry that's running off the scams, like scamming international communities in every country.
So have the Chinese, Thai and Myanmar authorities had any success in dismantling these networks and getting rid of these scam centres?
Unfortunately, I think my skeptical self says, no, we haven't seen the end of these scam centres. When we're talking about 100,000 people in one specific region, we're not looking at the broader area where in the entire Mekong region, we might have several 100,000 people. So we're looking at one region. We've said 7,000 people have been liberated out of 100,000. So we're looking at a very small percentage. I sit in a very kind of position where I speak to victims daily that are inside the scam centres, and most of them say that it's business as usual. They've obviously had to adapt to the way that things have to run. They've got 7,000 less workers. I think they are fearful of what might come, and I do hope that this trilateral agreement keeps pressure on, and we do actually see the militia military, which are in place providing protection of these scam centres, decide to support the trilateral agreement and go in and dismantle these centres. But unfortunately, I haven't really seen where the actual force is coming in order to dismantle. We've seen kind of an interruption in these last few weeks. And yeah, perhaps I would hope that it would be a little bit more.
Judah Tanner there in Bangkok. Judah, good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us on Counting the Cost.
Thank you very much.
And that is our show for this week. If you'd like to get in touch with us, I'm at @afinnegan on X. Try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC when you do comment, or you can drop us a line. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, and entire editions for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.